Cool. Well, welcome everyone to Nebraska Mycological Society's Spring Mushroom Series Part 2, Nebraska Mushrooms with Chance Brueggemann. Chance works for the Northern Prairies Land Trust, a nonprofit conservation organization partnered with the Nebraska Game and Parks Commission. Primarily based out of Indian Cave State Park, located in the southeastern corner of the state, he focuses on oak woodland restoration with the use of understory tree thinning, invasive species control, and returning fires back to the landscape. Chance became fascinated by mushrooms through his work at Indian Cave, where he was exposed to a diversity of fungi that he didn't know existed, especially in Nebraska. Since his colleagues who were proficient in plant ID didn't know much about mushrooms, he began studying fungi as an added asset for the field crew. After researching fungi and how they benefit the environment, including the oak woodland where he worked, his interest gained more traction. Nowadays, when in the field, Chance keeps his eyes peeled for species of mushrooms that are not already recorded in the state. When a new state record is found, he preserves the specimens to be turned into the state herbarium and studied for future years. So, Chance, how many mushrooms have you actually found that you were the first person in Nebraska to find them?
Well, I don't think it'd be fair to say I was the first person to find all these mushrooms, but to certainly ID them, I'd say, man, I think I have over 30, and I think this year I'll probably be submitting into the 40. I mean, not 40 new ones, but I think altogether, I think I've gotten about around 40 mushrooms that haven't been studied or found in the state and recorded, I guess would be the right way of saying that.
Wow, that's awesome.
Yeah, it's a lot of fun, really.
Cool. Well, yeah, as we go through the talk, if you have any questions, just feel free to post them in the chat and we'll get to them at the end. And yeah, with that, Chance, take it away.
All right. Well, thanks for joining me, everybody. I think it's great to be able to give a talk about some things that people are interested in learning. It makes me feel certainly less lonely in this field, and I'm glad to have this group here as well. All right. So let's get started. So what are macro-fungi and how can they benefit the environment and our health? So the question I often like to ask is, why learn about fungi? You may want to use fungi as a source of food. In this case, for me, I'm not a hunter by any means. I don't like to hunt, but I certainly like to look for mushrooms, and being able to incorporate them into my diet is even more fun, in my opinion. So in this case, I found chicken of the woods, which is an edible mushroom growing out in our woodlands. And I incorporated it into a stir fry. What's interesting about this mushroom is its texture similarity to chicken. If you were to split it apart, it's actually fibrous, kind of like chicken. And some folks actually claim it tastes like chicken, which I think with the right seasoning, it could. You may be wanting to avoid potential property damage. In this case, out at Indian Cave State Park, I found this massive red oak or northern red oak tree, which I just always liked it. I don't know, it just seemed kind of like the staple tree for the northern red oak, and I kind of favored it. And then months later, I drove by it and I found it laying horizontal and not standing anymore. And when I ran up to the trunk, I noticed these mushrooms at the base of it, and they're known as oak brackets, Pseudoinonotus striatus, and they're known as parasites of oak trees, and they generally focus on breaking down the lower portions of the tree, like the above the roots and the root layer. And this often leaves the tree susceptible to falling over into windstorms, excuse me. And knowing something like this could potentially save a building or potentially your house or your car if you happen to see something like this growing on your tree. So it helps to know things like this. You may be wanting to incorporate some medicinal properties from some of these mushrooms into your body. Right here we have the golden reishi, also known as Ganoderma curtisii, which I ID'd out at the park as well. And it is actually it's really closely related to a Chinese variety of this reishi known as the Lingzi mushroom. And this mushroom actually translates, Lingzi translates to the mushroom of immortality. And it's been used in traditional Chinese medicine for over 2,000 years. And it promotes good health and through a number of ways. It's an immune system enhancer, it's a cancer preventative, and it also has some antiviral properties in it. What I thought was kind of interesting about this mushroom and made me really want to find it was apparently in ancient China, some varieties of this mushroom were so sacred that they were given to the emperor. And I just found that so fascinating. You may want to learn about it because it's actually, or learn about fungi because a fungus is actually the largest organism on the planet. And it's in Oregon, up on a mountain range, and it spreads about 2,400 acres in size. And it has been estimated it's one of the oldest organisms as well. It is estimated to be 2,000 to 8,000 years old. And I know you may be looking at this photo and, squinting and seeing, oh, well, I don't see a mushroom. Well, we'll definitely get to that in a minute. You may want to be learning about it because in Nebraska, mycology is a dying study. Well, it may be on the rise again, but mushroom species aren't really regularly being documented. Hence, reason why I was able to more or less find 40 new species for the state. There's not enough public information on the mushrooms or about mushrooms on the state. There's some information, but I think there's definitely more information that needs to be relayed so people aren't so scared of mushrooms. One of the things I really think they need to touch on is mushrooms are really only toxic if you were to consume them. I think that's something that's always missing. And it was a surprise to me when I was learning about mushrooms. And up until December of last year, there were no mushroom clubs or organizations in the state. And these organizations would otherwise be really important because the lack of forays done. And a foray is usually when a group of people interested in mushrooms will go out in a certain area at a certain time and basically go on a massive mushroom hunt, meaning they'll pick any mushroom and then everybody brings what they found back to a central location and lay them out, in which they're all identified, or at least to the best of their ability. And this actually helps really kind of get a baseline of what species exist in a certain area, at least within a certain time frame. And that can really help out and lead to some interesting scientific discoveries in the meantime too. So what is a fungus? So by definition, a fungus is any group of unicellular, multicellular, or spore-producing organisms feeding on organic matter. And a lot of these are molds and yeasts, and of course, mushrooms. Their cell walls are made of chitin, which is a long chain of sugars. It's a polymer made out of a long chain of sugars. Fungi also use enzymes to break down and absorb their food. So what are macro-fungi versus micro-fungi? Macro-fungi are the unicellular fungi that form sexual reproductive structures called sporocarps, otherwise known as mushrooms. And they can be observed by the naked eye. But on the opposite end of the spectrum, you have micro-fungi, which are single-celled and multicellular fungi that form the structures that cannot be viewed by the naked eye. And these usually are your molds and your yeasts. So where do mushrooms come from? Now, this is something that really interested me when it came to the study of mushrooms initially, because before I even got into mushrooms, I remember I'd see these things growing in my front yard. And I remember I would pull them. Just anybody who doesn't know mushrooms is usually pretty scared of them. So I remember pulling them and throwing them away from my yard because I didn't want my dog to eat them and potentially die because I just didn't know enough about them. And every time I pulled them, I never saw any rooting mass or anything. It just seemed like there was nothing underneath it. And then when I tossed the mushroom and come back maybe 36 to 48 hours later, I would see another one, and sometimes equally of size in that. And I felt that was really magical. And I kind of wanted to learn more about that. And just a little bit of context, this mushroom right here is called the toxic lepiota, and it actually causes the most poisonings of mushrooms in the US. And that's usually because of its occurrence in lawns and just due to its toxicity. But usually people end up vomiting with diarrhea and a very upset stomach. So we'll start it while asking the question, what gives rise to mushrooms? We'll talk about some of the structures. The first structure we'll talk about is the hyphae, which are the long branching filamentous strands. They're also made of chitin, which is that polymer made out of sugars. They are responsible for pioneering through the soils in search of food, up to an inch per day, actually. And when eating, hyphae will deploy enzymes to break down organic debris to be absorbed by the fungus. They can be arranged tightly together to actually create the mushroom, which you can see in this diagram here. Next, we have the mycelium, which is basically the congregation mass of all those hyphal tissues together in one network. It is considered the vegetative portion of the fungus. It pioneers through the soils and feeds on the substrates. And it releases antibiotics into the surrounding environments. And if you think about how penicillin was discovered, it was discovered in a laboratory in petri dishes in which some fungus had contaminated some bacterial petri dishes and actually killed the bacteria in it. And then that's how they discovered penicillin. And the mycelial mats can actually be acres in size. And thinking about this and going back to that slide in Oregon, that is the mass of the mushroom that makes the largest organism in the planet, is that mycelial mat underground. And that's why you didn't see any mushroom. So next we have the spores, which are the microscopic reproductive cells released from the fruiting body. They're responsible for the replication and dispersal of the fungus, generally released in incredible numbers, sometimes by the billions. And spores are from different mushrooms, have variable shapes and sizes and surface textures. And then, so when it comes to mushroom identification, sometimes you have to go down to the spore level to confidently ID a mushroom because those spores have some information that's different from other mushrooms. The life cycle of a mushroom usually begins when spores are released from a mature mushroom. The spores will travel far, sometimes short, to a new location. If suitable, if it's a suitable location, the spores will actually germinate, and immature hyphae will emerge and creep in the soil. When two hyphae from two separate spores connect and mate, it creates a fertile mycelial mat, which can then give rise to a mushroom. And then when the mushroom grows and matures, then it can complete the cycle. And then sometimes other groups of mushrooms or species may have a different stage or have a stage within this life cycle. Sometimes there's an added one, and that could be to overwinter or could be to survive through drought conditions as well. But this is kind of the general life cycle you see for mushrooms. Okay, so now that we know more about the structures and everything, let's talk about the ecology of mushrooms. And ecology is usually defined as how an organism's relationship or how it interacts with things in its environment. And when you're talking about the ecology of mushrooms, you're usually talking about where does this fungus get its food source? So there's three different ecologies based on how they get their food. And they are the saprophytes, the parasites, and the mycorrhizae. Saprophytic mushrooms, they obtain their nutrients directly from dead organic matter. So they're the decomposers of the system. It can be found growing on dead grasses, leaves, and wood. And some may be more specialists where they prefer growing on, say, the shells of nuts. They're the largest group of fungi based on their ecology. And they break down highly complex structural compounds in woody debris, cellulose and lignin to be specific. And this causes the wood to ultimately rot when one of these or both of these are lost. And there's two types of rot based on which structural component is lost. So the first type of rot we'll talk about is the brown rot, which is the cause, or it's the loss of the cellulose structural component of the wood. Lignin component is still left intact, usually leaving the wood with a reddish brown, often block-like appearance. The next common type of rot we have is the white rot, which is when the lignin structural component of the wood is lost. The cellulose is still intact, giving the rotted wood a bleached, stringy, and kind of spongy-like appearance. Most saprobic mushrooms are white rotters. And an interesting thing about these is they create what's called nursery logs, usually white rot, a log that has been degraded by a white rot fungus will usually be, again, a bit spongy, and it actually accepts water very well. And since it's soft, sometimes seeds will fall in these logs and it actually will germinate, and they'll be able to root into these logs and grow. And this helps actually get a lot of plants going in the woods through these nursery logs. So there are levels of decomposition based on when the fungus shows up on, say, the dead organic matter. So the primary decomposers they're generally found, they're the first ones to show up on a log and to break down some of this crude and solid organic matter like wood. They don't have much competition for food because there's not many other organisms that can utilize wood in this state. The many mushrooms in this category are the edible and gourmet ones that can be cultivated and sold in stores. The secondary decomposers grow on the remaining substrate that is left by the primary decomposers. The substrates may be missing either the cellulose or lignin components of the wood. And during this stage of decomposition, the funguses will compete against other organisms for the log, and that is usually other fungi or the like burying beetles. And there is a third level of decomposition, but not too much is really known about that one yet, except that it's a follow-up after the secondary decomposition. So let's talk about what saprobes bring to the table as far as contributions. For starters, they break down the complex compounds in wood that are normally not utilized by other organisms. And if we didn't have any decomposers, if there were no decomposing funguses, systems, especially woodland systems, would often be choked out of just full of dead organic matter because there's nothing to break it down. So in breaking these down, it's creating habitat for organisms and just cleaning up the area. Otherwise, we'd be choked out by it. It's building more nutrient-rich soils. They're breaking down pollutants in the environment, which is also known as bioremediation. And a lot of this could be, a lot of things that are broken down are things like aromatic hydrocarbons, which can be petroleum oils and pesticides. When a fungus breaks down some of these aromatic hydrocarbons, they may render the chemical neutral entirely or less toxic than its previous state. So let's start off by talking about some saprobic mushrooms that you can find here in Nebraska. And the first one I want to talk about is the oyster mushrooms and the Pleurotus species. Nebraska has probably a handful of these Pleurotus species, and they're all generally primary decomposers of the crude wood in our systems. They like, a lot of the times they like the hardwoods, and I'm not entirely sure if they like so much coniferous wood or not, because we don't deal with that so much in our area. They're also, another interesting fact about them is they are considered carnivorous in a way because the mycelium consumes microorganisms known as nematodes in the substrate. And it uses those as that energy as kind of a supplemental food source. Oyster mushrooms are also premier bioremediators in a woodland system. There's been scientific studies that have kind of demonstrated that. One was a bioremediation study in Washington where wood chips were infected with the mycelium of oysters were introduced to piles of dirt that were contaminated with petroleum wastes. After several weeks of growth, the piles that were introduced with mushroom mycelium had changed from dark, sterile pile to a normal soil color which was able to provide life for plants and stuff. It also had a ton of mushrooms growing from it as well. And the study kind of demonstrated that not only was these oysters a bioremediator of the oils and petroleum waste, but it was also able to feed off these petroleum waste as well, which I thought was fascinating. Another saprobic mushroom we can run into here in Nebraska is called the crown-tipped coral mushroom, or Artemisia pyxidatus. This one is, I usually find this one growing on hardwood logs, a lot of times in kind of low riparian areas in woodlands. It's an edible mushroom actually, and it belongs to a group of fungi called the coral fungi, which include a bunch of kind of multi-branching erect fungi that often resemble coral. Another saprobic mushroom in Nebraska is known as the dryad saddle, Cereoporus squamosus. And this is an example of a mushroom known as a polypore, which is a mushroom that has, instead of, on the underside, it has, instead of the traditional gills or the folds that we're used to seeing, and it has pores. And this one I find a lot of times growing on hardwood trees as well throughout the growing season. And an interesting thing about it is it has a very pungent watermelon rind or cucumber smell. I mean, it just like to the T, it smells like it, at least to me. And it is also another edible mushroom in our area. So this one, last one I'm going to talk about is the fan-shaped jelly fungus, Dacryopinax spathularia. And this one belongs to a group of fungi called the jelly fungi, which include some other gelatinous mushrooms of all different colors and shapes and sizes. This one I generally find growing on hardwood logs, kind of growing in kind of these lateral lines along the cracks. I've also found it growing on treated wood, and for example, the bench that I eat my lunch on. So maybe there could be some bioremediation properties of this mushroom as well. So let's move on to the second group of fungi based on their ecology, and they're known as the parasitic mushrooms. And they're characterized by fungi that obtain their nutrients from living organisms or the living tissues of these organisms. They're generally revered as blights of a system. Some parasites are weakly parasitic and some more opportunistic. And these are known as facultative parasites. Usually facultative parasites, they're also known as weak parasites because instead of feeding on the live tissues, they more or less leave the live tissues be and they'll feed on the dead organic matter connected to the live tissues. So what contributions do parasites bring to the system, which is a very interesting thought. Facultative parasites can prevent the onset of more threatening parasites. If you think about it in a way of fungal competition, if a fungus infects a tree, it more or less wants that food for itself. So if it could defend that tree against other mushrooms, potentially a more dangerous or more lethal mushroom, that's not too bad. You know, you rather live a little bit than just die outright. Parasitic mushrooms can serve as a natural selection event, weeding out the weaker trees in a system. And this is something that us humans find it really hard to come to grips to. No one really likes to think of trees dying in a woodland good, but our lives are relatively short compared to the life of a woodland or other ecosystems. So when a parasitic mushroom comes in and kills off the dead or the weaker trees and leaving the stronger trees to reproduce, in the end, that's going to look better, or it's going to have a better outlook of stronger trees in the system. Parasites that kill trees actually create habitat for other organisms. A good example, or some scientific evidence has shown that a standing dead tree can actually sometimes provide, can inhabit more organisms than a live tree can. This is not the same for all circumstances, but certainly in some. So let's talk about some of the parasitic mushrooms that can be found in Nebraska. So starting with the honey mushroom, Armalea malea. This one is actually a sister taxa, or closely related to the organism that is considered the largest on the planet. Luckily for us here in Nebraska, this one is not so much of a tree killer like the one in Oregon is. This one is actually considered, some people consider it a facultative parasite. Some people think it's more than that, but generally we see this one growing on trees that are stressed and just kind of dying already. And so they just kind of finishes them off. And it does that by the use of using thick strands of hyphae called rhizomorphs, where it will basically girdle the tree by splitting the bark off the main trunk and killing off the vascularized tissue of that tree. And I like to joke about this mushroom because when these things are fruiting, I see them everywhere in the park. And I like to think that I'm standing over the largest organism in the planet. So maybe we'll have to test that someday. Next parasitic mushroom we'll talk about is the ash heart rot fungus, Perenniporia fraxinophylla. And as the name suggests, it's one that infects ash trees, and it actually feeds on the heart tissues or the core wood of these trees, which is normally dead. But in doing so, it weakens these trees, because usually the heart tissues are a kind of a structural component of the tree. And I have one right here. And unlike the other mushrooms I've talked about previously, this one is a perennial mushroom, and it is also woody, very hard. And each year it actually puts a new growth ring on it, similar to a tree, in which it develops pores and can drop more spores from. You could actually core this one out similar to a tree and count the rings of growth on it and get an estimate of how old it is, which I think is kind of cool. So next we have the hen of the woods, Grifola frondosa, which is generally revered as another facultative parasite. I find it growing a lot of times at the base of oak trees. There's been reports of it growing at the base of other trees, but very rarely. It is an edible mushroom, and it can grow pretty large in size. I find, well, I guess the picture on the right-hand side is probably about 10 to 15 pounds of mushroom, and it can certainly grow larger than that. And it's an edible mushroom, if I hadn't mentioned that before, and it's always a treat to find that, because you usually find enough for weeks. The next mushroom we'll talk about, the black staining polypore, also known as Meripolis substinii, it's kind of a close lookalike to the hen of the woods as well. A lot of people looking for hen of the woods may actually pick this one instead and take it home to eat. Luckily for them, it's what us mycologists would consider a tasty mistake, because it is also edible as well. Ways to distinguish this one is based on its name. You can actually scratch it and observe a black staining reaction. In that middle photo, you can see three little, I can't remember if I made those or if those are claw marks or something from something, but yeah, that is the reaction of that mushroom. It also grows at the base of hardwoods, primarily oak trees in our area. And I also think this one is a facultative parasite as well, more regarding the dead tissues and leaving the live tissues be. So now that we've gone through some of those examples, we'll talk about the third group, ecologically mushrooms. And these are the mycorrhizal fungi. And they're characterized by fungi that obtain their nutrients through a symbiotic relationship with a plant at its roots, or multiple plants at its root tips. And this in this relationship, the fungus will provide nutrients and water from the environment in return for carbohydrates derived from photosynthesis from the plant. Both plant and the fungus benefit from this relationship. And there are two main groups of mycorrhizal fungi. And the first one is the endomycorrhizal fungi, whose hyphal tissues penetrate into the root cells of the partnered plant. This does not cause any damage to the roots at all. Most common type of mycorrhizal symbiosis. And the fungi in this group do not produce mushrooms. In fact, they produce spores directly on the mycelium themselves. So this makes them hard to study in the field, and you generally need a lab for this. The next one we have are the ectomycorrhizal fungi. And these are fungi whose hyphal tissues house the root tips in a sheath-like structure. Some of these hyphal strands penetrate between the root cells, and again, not causing any damage. It's the least common type of the symbiosis, and they generally pair with woody plants, trees and shrubs. And the mushrooms are produced in this group. So this is the ones we're most familiar with because we can at least observe it in the field. So what do mycorrhizal fungi bring to the system? For starters, they increase water absorption radius of the plants associated. So you can kind of think of them as a root extension of the plant. They shuttle limited nutrients to paired plants such as phosphorus and nitrogen. They also enrich soils with micronutrients such as calcium, in which they get from weathering nearby rocks with enzymes. They also increase disease resistance of the plants associated. Some plants are dependent on fungal symbiosis at a young stage in life, or sometimes for the entirety. And some examples of this are orchids for sure. For at least getting orchids, their seeds aren't really equipped with much energy storage in them. So they kind of need to hit the ground running. And mycorrhizal fungi actually help sort of wean these plants at a young age until they become more self-sufficient. And then you have mycoheterotrophic plants, which like this Indian pipe on this photo here, which rely solely on a mycorrhizal fungus to survive. You can see that it has not a speck of green in it at all. So it lacks chlorophyll entirely. So it needs to get energy through a different means, and usually it piggybacks off a mushroom mycelium. So let's talk about some of the mycorrhizal mushrooms that can be found here in the state. And starting off, this is one of my favorite mushrooms to come across in the woods. It's known as Old Man of the Woods, or Strobilomyces flocopus. And I have flocopus in quotations because it is subject for a name change, because we are currently using the European name for it, when genetics has suggested that the species we have over here is significantly different from that over there. So pretty soon I'll be changing that name to something else. But what's interesting about this mushroom is that, unlike your normal looking toadstools, it has pores on the underside, unlike the normal gills that we're used to seeing. And it's called a bolete, and a lot of boletes have that, or all boletes, mostly all the boletes have that characteristic of the pores underneath. And another cool thing about it is when you cut it in half, it actually goes from kind of a whitish color to a red color over time, and then black. The spines on the top of the cap are actually kind of woolly-like. It's really bizarre when you see something like this and you find out it's a mushroom. And it is actually revered as edible, but I think it makes quite a mess in the pan when you cook it. I'll have to try it sometime, but I don't come across it that often, but it is special when I do. I see this one growing around oak trees a lot of the time, and potentially other hardwoods in that area. Next mushroom I'm going to talk about that's mycorrhizal in Nebraska is the destroying angel, Amanita bisporigera. And this one is one of the deadly toxic mushrooms here in Nebraska, but again, only if eaten or consumed is it an issue. It It pairs with oak trees as well. I usually find it around woodland edges a little bit. And it may be mycorrhizal with other hardwood species of trees as well. In the US, we have 3 total species of mushrooms that we refer to as the destroying angel, and they're all related. This one in particular can be separated from those other 2 with the use of chemical reaction. And on the right photo, you can see there's kind of yellow along the margin of the cap there. That is the reaction of potassium hydroxide. And the other 2 species of destroying angel do not exhibit this reaction. So that's how I was able to identify this one confidently. So we have next is the yellow-tipped coral, Ramaria formosa. This one, similar to the last coral mushroom I mentioned, it's also in the coral fungi group. But unlike those ones, this one is actually mycorrhizal, and it pairs with primarily oak trees and potentially other hardwoods, and rarely conifers, according to literature. For someone who was initially interested in marine biology, I really love finding these out in the woods and just kind of seeing these ocean-like characters in the woods. Here's another bolete similar to Old Man of the Woods. This is called the bitter bolete, Tylopolis rubobrunnens. And this one, like the name suggests, it is very bitter. In fact, every time I find it, it's almost in pristine condition. And I think I attribute that to its super bitter tastes. And I find this one growing around oaks and hickories a lot of the time. It tends to be the largest bolete I find out at the park. In fact, the largest one I had found was probably about 8, the cap was probably about 8 inches in diameter, which is a huge mushroom. And I wish I could see that mycelial mat that put that off and how many trees it may be connected to. So now that we got done with those, there's actually some mushrooms that have a combination of ecological roles. The honey mushroom, for instance, the honey mushroom located in Oregon, Armillaria astoye, is both parasitic and saprobic, meaning it has a really good life cycle in which it can consume both living and non-living tissues and can stick around longer. Morel mushrooms are speculated to be both mycorrhizal and saprobic. And many polypore mushrooms are often considered both parasitic and saprobic. And I think that's where the facultative parasite kind of falls into play. It's kind of a mixture of both or on the fence. So mushrooms and our health. So now that we know more about mushrooms and what they do for the environment, how do they affect our health? Mushrooms have been scientifically proven to be a candidate for improving our body's health, either by adding certain mushrooms to our diet or by supplementary means. The consumption of edible mushrooms can benefit our body with small sources of protein, though I wouldn't count on eating mushrooms solely to achieve those daily needs. Mushrooms have low amounts of cholesterol and fats, which make a healthy choice for heart health. They also contain low amounts of carbohydrates, roughly 15 grams per cup of button mushrooms. The number may vary slightly based on the type of mushroom. Some scientists believe that the body actually burns more calories digesting mushrooms than it gains from eating them. So eating edible mushrooms may be a way of losing weight. So along with good nutrition, mushrooms provide many constituents to further promote good health in our bodies. For instance, many medicinal mushrooms contain antioxidants that other foods have very little of. Antioxidants are very important for eliminating free radicals, which are chemicals produced during food digestion that can otherwise lead to diseases, including cancer down the road. Polysaccharides are very common in edible fungi, and they often involve regulating immune system function by either stimulating it if it's underperforming or bringing it down if it's overperforming. So starting with some of the medicinal mushrooms we can find in Nebraska, we have the lion's mane, Erinaceum erinaceus. And this mushroom not only is it a medicinal mushroom, but it doubles up as a edible gourmet mushroom. And the interesting thing about this one is it's described to have a lobster-like texture while actually tasting like lobster. And I think kind of with chicken of the woods, I think it may taste like lobster if you season it right, you know. But this mushroom grows on the wood of hardwood trees, often found in hollowed cavities during cool temperatures in the spring and again in the fall. It has a source of antioxidants that can help alleviate inflammation issues, which can help with depression, heart disease, and diabetes. Scientific studies in mice show that this mushroom has potential for improving cognitive function and potentially reducing the chance of neurological diseases such as Alzheimer's and dementia. The next one we'll talk about is a familiar face for sure. It is the hen of the woods. It has polysaccharides that can help regulate the immune system by, again, either stimulating it if it's underperforming or cool it down if it's overperforming. One of the polysaccharides identified, called diffraction, can actually help with treating breast cancer and bladder cancers. Hen of the woods is also a great source of vitamin D. And morels are actually medicinal as well, not just a tasty treat. They are a great source of vitamin D, especially exposed with the sun. This is because, like other mushrooms, morels create more vitamin D when their cells are exposed to sunlight. A polysaccharide isolate from morels, known as galactomannan, has shown to stimulate immune system by increasing the blood cell activity, or the white blood cell activity. Scientific studies are starting to show some promise with creating, or by using the mushroom mycelium to produce more antioxidants in the future years. And last medicinal mushroom that we'll cover that can be found here in Nebraska is the turkey tail mushroom, Trametes versicolor. And unlike all the other mushrooms I discussed, except that reishi at the very beginning, it is also not just edible. You can't cook this one up and eat it. It's a bit tough and leathery. So in order to get some of the constituents out of it, you have to either boil it in water or get some of the alcohol soluble constituents out through alcohol extraction. Let's see. Beta glucans derived from this mushroom have the properties that can help regulate our immune systems. Scientific research has also suggested that these beta glucans can be useful for treating and preventing lung, gastro, and colorectal cancers. In 2012, there was actually a clinical study involving turkey tail that was conducted on women recovering from chemotherapy for breast cancer. And the conclusion was that women utilizing turkey tail extracts had faster recovering immune system after receiving the chemo and radiotherapy. And for all these mushrooms, I'm really just skimming the top of all these medicinal uses for them. I could certainly talk about these longer if I had the time. So now that you know more about fungi and what they do ecologically in the wild and what they can do for our bodies, what's not to like about them, I hope this presentation has helped you answer the question, why learn about fungi? And at this time, I'd like to open the floor to any questions, comments, or anything else.
Chance, how'd you learn about and get into microscopy for mushrooms?
Man, I think it was through multiple sources. I feel like I haven't really even scratched the surface on the microscopy sense. Like if there's a mushroom that I know I have to ID, I have to get into the microscope to look. Sometimes I'll put that on the back burner, but I started out looking at mushroomexpert.com has like really good sources on how to do microscopy and just direction. I started off with that, and just looking at spores just to look at spores. And then I don't know, I'll just kind of use multiple sources. I've looked a little bit on YouTube as well, but it's something I hope to dive into a little bit more, especially when I start to, I get a micrometer and I'm able to measure spore dimensions.
Cool. We have a question in the chat from Mercy. What's the coolest mushroom that you've seen at Indian Cave so far?
The coolest mushroom, I think, probably has to be, and I'm saying this just because it seems to be so rare. It might have to be, there's a species of truffle that I discovered down there by when we do our prescribed burns, we use leaf blowers to blow the leaf duff off the woodland floor to create areas in which a fire can't jump at least easily. And in doing so, I uncovered this orange little globular fungus on the floor, and I pulled it up and I took pictures, and I more or less put it on the back burner, and eventually contacted one of the guys in our group who's a professor out at UNL, and we did some genetics on it and found out it was indeed a species of truffle, and it was a rare one at that. In fact, it's probably, last time I looked at the records, I want to say it had about 15 records for it in the US and nowhere else, just the US, and maybe in like 5 different states as well. But what's really interesting about it, and I don't know if this has really been mentioned, but I noticed on the distribution map, they are all on the same horizontal latitude, if that's right, across the United States, at least from Nebraska eastward to, oh, I can't remember where the last state was, but it to me, I find that really interesting and cool. And I've found it several times at Indian Cave, so sometimes I really question how rare it is. It's just hard to see since it's hypogeneous fungi living underground.
Wow, that's really cool. So we have another one from Barbara. With the rising popularity of mushroom hunting, are people endangering their reproductive ability? Are the popular morels, chicken and hen of the woods, chaga, etc., able to come back through their spores and mycelium?
Now, I do believe there was some research done on some of these mushrooms, probably particular morels. And if I'm correct, morels weren't really bothered by being overpicked, so to speak. Because a lot of the times when folks go out and they pull morel mushrooms, they'll have, well, they should have a basket or some sort of bag that's not plastic and can let it breathe more. And then walking through the woods with these mushrooms, it actually is a type of spore dispersal, whether it's designed for us or not. It is releasing spores across the woodland floor, doing them a bit of a favor. And so it's not quite like taking the fruits and seeds out of the woods. You're taking the fruits, but it is spilling the seeds out as you're going. So I think you're doing them a favor in that respect. But as for other things, chaga, I believe, is a bit different. Chaga, I think, takes time to develop. I believe it's a perennial mushroom. I've never seen it here, so I don't know too much about it. But things that take longer to develop, like the perennial mushrooms, I believe do take a hit when people over harvest those.
From Allison, how can Nebraskans participate with sending in mushroom genetics?
From what I understand, I mean, what I do is I just I don't even know if you truly have to identify it down to species level or not, but I collect the mushroom, and when I try and identify it, and when I feel confident with the identification, I'll actually dry. I'll have my specimens at home, and I'll dry as many as I can, and store them to be turned into a local herbarium. And with all, when you do this, you want to have as much information on the mushroom as possible. You want to describe kind of where you found it, timing is definitely important. The trees around the area, just in case it's a mycorrhizal mushroom, it's really important to know what trees are in the area, and just have that information ready to submit to your herbarium.
How can one get in contact with their herbarium?
Well, at least the one that I go through, which is closely located near me, is the Bessie Herbarium located on UNL campus in Lincoln. There is another herbarium in Chadron, Nebraska, which is much further away from where I live. And both of them have contact information. And UNK, I believe, might be developing an herbarium or a fungarium for mushrooms as well. So just looking up, typing in herbarium in Nebraska, it may narrow down your searches that way. The Bessie one is certainly a popular one because not only is it Nebraska one, it accepts stuff from all over as well. They have like over maybe 50,000 mushroom records there, I believe. So.
From Mercy, are there major differences between species found in North and Southeast Nebraska in the oak woodlands? Anything noteworthy?
You say north to south, I'm sorry.
Difference between species found in North and Southeast Nebraska.
Yeah, I think so. Certainly, as you go up north, you can run into, I don't know if it's so much northeast Nebraska, but I know in some portions of northern Nebraska, you can get into different tree species like birch. So you can certainly run into, say, the birch polypore up there, which you can't find down here because birches, they just don't occur naturally. There's a possibility that it could be growing on something that was planted here, but not as likely. And if there's any coniferous trees up there as well, that would certainly bring in a different variety of fungi that we have here in the Southeast. So yes, I do think there could be some differences. I need to get out of the Southeast and start traveling more and checking out other places to kind of find this out for myself. I feel sheltered where I'm at.
Well, for being sheltered there, you have a lot of mushrooms compared to the rest of the state.
Yeah, you're right. I have a lot of work to do down here.
And Barbara said chaga is a big concern where birch woods are more common. So birch isn't very common in Nebraska, so that makes sense overall. And so next from Dakota, are there plans for mushroom forays to occur this year at Indian Cave or other Nebraska woodlands? If so, how can others participate?
We're certainly, as a group at the Nebraska Mycological Society, we're trying to get some of these things in the works at the moment. And I think it's something we're definitely going to be able to do. Last year, it seemed to, well, the group really wasn't around last year, but we were certainly thinking about getting out doing some mini forays last year. But with COVID, kind of stomped a lot of that out. I think this year it's certainly seeming plausible. So us and the group we're looking at some areas to go. And I think Indian Cave may be a start. And Jarek, if you wanted to touch in on that.
Yeah, so our first scheduled get together is on the 24th of this month, and that's going to be at Indian Cave. Indian Cave is having a morel mile. There's a 5K run and mushroom hunting contest and lots of other stuff that they have going on. Seems really cool. And so we'll have a booth there if everything goes as planned. And so you'll be able to meet us. And but so far, that's the only thing that we have planned. We are just going to try and meet up when the mushrooms are around rather than planning something far out and then everyone makes plans for the next 3 months and then we show up and there's no mushrooms. So a way you can stay in the loop for that is to check out our website. I put a link in chat to our calendar, and that has everything going on this month and further. And then the other ways that you can keep up with what we're doing is to follow us on Instagram and Facebook. And also on the website, there's a link to join. And if you join, we'll add you to the email list. So any event that we have coming up, you'll be notified.
Yeah, please join. We need more eyes on the ground.
And we do have plans to do a lot of sequencing of mushrooms that we find at these forays, because like Chance said, the mycology in Nebraska has been lacking for the last 100 years. And so we have goals to try and change that and have an idea of what grows around here, and do something about getting people more educated on mushrooms around here, and just have an idea of what's going on in our state. And with that, it doesn't look like we have any more questions in chat. Chance, thanks for giving your excellent talk. This was really great.
Yeah,
Really
thanks
thorough.
for having me.